5 names, 5 organizations, 5 chapters in the history of American organized crime that shaped the country in ways most history books refuse to fully acknowledge. And then, at the end, one more name. The one that explains all the others. The one that was never a family, never a boss, never a territory, but without whom none of the others could have operated at the scale they did. But we'll get to him last. Because that's where he belongs, at the end of everything, holding the ledger. Let's start at the beginning. Number 5. Al Capone and the Chicago Outfit. If you ask most Americans to name a mobster, they say Al Capone. This tells you something about the power of mythology, because Capone, for all his genuine ferocity and genuine organizational capability, was in many ways the least sophisticated of the 5 names on this list. He was brilliant. He was brutal. He ran Chicago's bootlegging operation during Prohibition with a ruthlessness and business acumen that made him briefly one of the most powerful criminal figures in American history. At his peak in the late 1920s, Capone's organization was generating an estimated $60 million a year in revenue, the equivalent of over $1 billion today. But Capone made the mistake that Lansky never made. He was visible. He courted the press. He gave interviews. He sat in the front row at baseball games and let the cameras find him. He was, in the language of a later era, a brand. And brands attract attention, and attention attracts federal investigators, and federal investigators eventually find something. In Capone's case, they found 7 years of tax evasion. He went to Alcatraz in 1931. He died in Florida in 1947, his mind already gone from the syphilis that had been consuming him for years. The Chicago outfit he built did not die with him. Under a succession of bosses, Nitti, Rica, Accardo, Giancana, it became considerably more sophisticated than anything Capone had left. The outfit had its hands in Las Vegas casino operations, in labor unions, in political corruption that reached into the highest levels of Illinois government. It was, by the time Capone's successors had finished refining it, considerably more durable than the man who built it. The lesson: visibility kills. Number 4. The 5 families of New York. Not one organization, 5 of them, operating in parallel, managing territories and disputes according to rules established in 1957 and maintained for decades afterward. The Genovese family, the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, the Bonanno family, 5 organizations that collectively controlled the waterfront, the garment district, the construction industry, the garbage collection business, and a dozen other sectors of New York's economy for the better part of the 20th century. What made the New York families different from Capone's Chicago operation was structural sophistication. The Commission, the governing body established by Luciano in 1931, with Lansky's financial architecture supporting its operations, created a framework for resolving disputes without open warfare. The families understood earlier than most that stability was more profitable than conflict. The FBI's RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s produced some of the most dramatic courtroom moments in American legal history. The Commission trial of 1986, in which the bosses of 4 of the 5 families were convicted simultaneously, felt like the end of an era. In some ways it was, but the organizations themselves did not disappear. They contracted. They adapted. Some continue operating today. Number 3. The Genovese family, the Ivy League of organized crime. Of all the 5 families, the Genovese represents the most sophisticated expression of what Italian-American organized crime could become when it prioritized invisibility over theater. Named for Vito Genovese, one of the most ruthless and paranoid figures in the history of American crime, the family survived his imprisonment and continued under leaders who understood that discretion was the organization's greatest asset. The Genovese family, Unlike the Gambinos under John Gotti's theatrical leadership, almost never made the news. This was policy, not accident. The organization understood that the families that attracted cameras attracted prosecutors, and that the families that attracted prosecutors eventually lost. Its approach? Quiet, careful, deeply embedded in labor unions and legitimate business fronts. Resistant to infiltration, made it by many law enforcement assessments the most powerful and most durable of the 5 families through the RICO era and beyond. This approach, the deliberate cultivation of invisibility, the preference for institutional control over dramatic dominance, connects the Genovese family most directly to the figure at the end of this list. The man who taught everyone that the most powerful position is the one no one can see. Number 2. The Lucchese family and the airport rackets. The Lucchese family's particular contribution to the history of American organized crime was the systematic exploitation of transportation infrastructure, the airports, the docks, the trucking routes. The Luccheses understood earlier and more thoroughly than most that money moves through physical infrastructure, and that whoever controls the physical infrastructure controls the money. JFK International Airport, in its mid-century peak, was, by multiple accounts, one of the most thoroughly mob-infiltrated workplaces in the country. Cargo disappeared from planes with a regularity that the airlines found alarming. The Lufthansa heist of 1978, in which a crew associated with the Lucchese family stole approximately $6 million in cash and jewelry, the largest cash robbery in American history at the time, was dramatic enough to anchor Goodfellas. But the Lufthansa heist was the exception, not the rule. The rule was quieter. Systematic skimming from cargo operations, from union contracts, from the movement of goods through a transportation network the Luccheses had spent decades infiltrating. The dramatic robbery was what got the attention. The quiet, ongoing exploitation of infrastructure was what generated the money. Which brings us to number 1, the figure without whom the modern American mob, as a coherent institutional structure, probably does not exist. Number 1. Lucky Luciano and the architecture of everything. Charles Lucky. Luciano came to America from Sicily as a child, grew up on the Lower East Side, and emerged in his 20s as the most visionary organizational thinker American organized crime had produced. What Luciano understood, and what separates him from every other figure on this list, was that the ethnic and territorial fragmentation of American organized crime in the early 20th century was its primary weakness. The constant, expensive, attention-generating warfare between organizations that could have been generating money together. Luciano ended this. The creation of the National Crime Syndicate, the governing body that brought together the Italian families, the Jewish operators, and the various other criminal organizations into a functioning cooperative structure, was his achievement. The Commission was his achievement. The systematic corruption of law enforcement and political figures on a scale that provided durable institutional protection for criminal operations. His achievement. And at the center of all of it, a financial architecture that Luciano did not design and could not have designed. Because Luciano thought about power in terms of territory and violence and political relationships, he needed someone who thought about power in terms of money and systems and the specific vulnerabilities of legal and financial institutions. He needed Meyer Lansky, and here we arrive at the figure who belongs at the end of every list of American organized crime. Not because he was the most violent, not because he was the most visible, not because his name is the most recognizable, but because he was the most important. Lansky was the financial architect of everything the other entries on this list depended on. The casino schemes that funded the families, the offshore accounts that protected their money from federal seizure, the shell corporations that made the ownership of assets untraceable, the relationship with Swiss banks that created a wall behind which criminal revenue could exist without American law enforcement being able to touch it. He was investigated for 40 years. The IRS pursued him with the same strategy that had destroyed Capone: prove the income, prove the tax evasion, build the case from the money. They could not find the money. It was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, distributed across a financial architecture so sophisticated that the FBI agent assigned to trace it famously told his colleagues that following Lansky's money was like trying to grab smoke. When he died in 1983, his estate was valued at $57,000. The FBI estimated his actual controlled wealth at $300 million. The gap between those two numbers is the measure of how completely his system worked. Capone built an empire and lost it to a tax bill. Luciano built a structure and went to prison for it. The 5 families were dismantled by RICO prosecutions that took years to produce. Lansky died in his bed, in a modest apartment on Collins Avenue, with his wife beside him, having outlasted every serious federal prosecution attempt for 60 years. The most powerful figure in the history of American organized crime was the one you've probably never heard of. The one who never carried a gun. The one who built the system that all the others depended on, and then made himself invisible inside it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is where the history gets interesting, and we're just getting started.